Happy October, Nightmare Society family. Please forgive my voice as I'm a bit under the weather at the moment. I've procured some special holiday stories that fit right into the spooky All Hallows Eve vibe. So get comfy and prepare yourself for another episode of
The Nightmare Society.
I know it's probably said a lot, and as always, there's really no way to verify it. But what I'm about to tell you is 100% true. I'm not talented enough to make this up. Around 2 years ago, I finally moved into a brand new house in a brand new building estate in Australia. I was one of the first to have a finished build in the area and was elated to finally gain independence. The first few weeks went by as normal, and during that time I'd often take walks alone with the dog in the afternoons and roam around the estate area. All the roads around us had been partially completed and all the other properties were marked out, but no other houses were built, excluding one that was directly opposite of mine. The house looked finished, but there was no driveway laid yet, and from what I could gather, no one lived there. To the left of my house, roughly a few hundred meters away, was a field with a huge hill on it. I later found out that the whole area was council property. Not only was no one allowed to build up there, but the whole hill was basically a no-go zone. For whatever reason, the council just didn't want people on it, so the whole area was surrounded by a huge chain-link fence. The only other noticeable feature in the area was a small abandoned farmhouse with a shed a few kilometers down the road. I knew nothing about it and often went walking there with the dog as it gave me something mild to explore amongst the vast nothingness I was living around. The entire place was dilapidated and completely inhabitable, but it was still interesting nonetheless. About a month or two after moving in, I awoke one morning to the sound of a violin. It sounded extremely distant and quite haunting. I actually enjoyed it and assumed that the neighbors opposite me had finally moved in. Excited that I finally had some people to talk to, I peeked out the curtain and saw the house opposite mine was still as vacant as it ever was. I got dressed, but by the time I managed to look outside, the violin had stopped. This happened roughly every second day for the next week. The violin would wake me up and then just disappear after about 45 seconds. I would ignore it to the point where my curiosity simply got the better of me, and the next morning when I heard the violin playing again, I immediately jumped out of bed, threw on my dressing gown, and shot out the front door. I scoured the early morning surrounding, and there, up on the hill, was a figure playing a violin. It was barely light, but the person looked very tall from the distance I was at. And as they were playing, they were doing what could only be described as a waltz-type walk, spinning slowly around in a circle as they played. I took my eyes off the person and walked over to pick up the morning paper, and in the 10 seconds that took me, I heard the violin stop. When I looked up, I noticed the figure was no longer playing or dancing, but now standing still, most likely looking in my direction. It was so dark I couldn't make out anymore, and we both just stood there for half a minute, not moving before the creeps got the better of me and I went back inside. After that morning, things started happening. On my walks, I began to notice footprints on the surrounding properties that were not made by me and that I had never seen before, which I just assumed were from people walking up from the other housing areas down the road. I never awoke to the violin, but I swore I could hear someone walking on the street next to my bedroom window in the early mornings. However, I never saw anything. Other really general things happened as well, like random tools such as spades and rakes laying around the area, which I guessed were left by their construction crews, none of which I ever saw. I would start getting calls at work that would immediately hang up on me, and I also stopped walking up to the abandoned farmhouse, as the experience with the violin player had me a little shaken. One night, as I was heading to bed, I turned off the television in the living room, and again I could hear the faint sound of a violin playing. However, it sounded more muffled and rehearsed. I froze and a cold chill flowed through me instantaneously. Considering that it was about midnight and not the usual time I'd be hearing it, I went to the front window and peeked out to see that there was a light in the house opposite mine. It was clearly a candle, as I could see the dim light flicker in the empty window, and the music sounded like it was coming from an old record player. But in the 10 minutes I watched, I never saw any movement inside the house. I moved away from the window sufficiently freaked out, and after about another 5 minutes, I heard the music abruptly stop. I peeked out again to notice the light was now out. I never saw anyone. I began to become unsettled in the house and would often invite friends over to hang out until late. But of course, nothing would ever happen when someone else was with me. I never bothered to tell any of my friends, as without evidence, I figured they'd just give me crap about it and I'd just become more agitated. But nothing compared to what happened next. In my living area, the desk sits right next to a small window which looks out to the fence surrounding my property. The steel fence is literally an arm's length from the house and about 6 feet tall, so I always figured that, unlike most of the other windows, I would never need to cover this one with a sheet or a blanket because no one could ever see in. I usually had headphones on when I played, and I always had the lights off, for no other reason than I preferred to play video games in the dark. One night when I was gaming, I got up and walked into the dark kitchen and got a beer out of the fridge. It was dead silent, excluding the faint sound coming out of my headphones. As I closed the fridge and turned around to face the desk, I saw directly out the window 2 very faint lights. I didn't even catch on and immediately started walking back to the desk, fixated on the small glowing balls. And it wasn't until I had my nose almost pressed against the glass that I realized the 2 lights were not lights at all. They were eyes. A set of eyes, sitting just above the fence line, staring wide open at me. They did not blink. They did not move. My entire body locked up. All I could do was simply stare back as my brain was still comprehending that there was an actual person looking at me in the scariest way I could possibly ever imagine. I don't know what happened. Either my head kicked into gear or my muscles loosened, but my body automatically collapsed and I fell to the floor, scurrying to hide against the wall from the window. I could hear my heart beating through the carpet like a drum as I tried to lay as flat as possible, and as my mind was still processing the sheer severity of the situation, a violin started playing. That freaking violin and the haunting tune it always emitted started up, except this time it was directly outside my window and much louder than I'd ever heard it before. The lights were still off, and I wanted to get up to turn off the PC screen so I couldn't be seen, but my whole body just was not prepared to cooperate. Not only was the sound of the instrument extraordinarily loud, but it sounded like it was being played with frustration. Notes being missed frequently and the strings screeching. The pace of it was getting faster and faster, and by this time my dog Jeb out in the backyard had picked up on the situation, and registering an unfamiliar sound, gave one solitary deep bark. The violin instantly stopped and the house was finally dead silent, excluding my headphones, which I could hear quietly working away. I was still frozen to the carpet, and it wasn't until Jeb gave a second menacing bark that I heard the figure outside the window start to walk away in the direction of my yard. Once that first footstep hit the ground, I instantly thought of the welfare of my best mate, and finally my head connected with my extremities and my entire body kicked into overdrive. I leapt from the ground and slid across the laminated floor to the back door where Jeb was standing, staring into the backyard. I ducked to keep low and quietly unlocked and slid open the door. Usually doing so would notify Jeb that he was allowed inside, but when the door opened up, he didn't move an inch and was completely fixated on the pitch-black backyard. Everything told me not to go outside, but there was no chance I was letting anything happen to my dog, and I moved out into the alfresco, moved behind Jeb, put my hand under his collar and attempted to back him toward the house. Jeb is a pure Labrador and weighs like a sack of sand, so when he doesn't want to move, it takes a sheer force to pull him in the direction you want him to go, and right now, Jeb was not going anywhere. I yanked at his scruff, and as I did, he emitted a bark like I had never heard before. A deep, bellowing, screw you right off sound that elevated my nerves to an all-time high. We both just stood there, waiting for some form of reply, and I couldn't remember how long we both just froze there, but eventually I heard footsteps from around the side of the house begin to walk away. But not a simple walk, almost like whoever was doing it was slowly dancing in a circle, the footsteps keeping to a beat as they drifted away from the house into the distance. Once I couldn't hear anything, Jeb licked his lips, gave me a look, and wandered back inside. I followed, locked the door behind me, and spent the night reverting to my childlike self, hiding under my bed covers with my dog. I did not sleep a wink. That was the last time I ever saw or heard the violin player. The following morning, when the sun finally came up, I called into work sick and called the police. They scoured the lot next to mine and found footprints in the dirt. However, there were so many that it was impossible to tell whose were whose. The only description I could give to the officer was his height. He would have had to be over 6 feet to stare over that fence at me, but they explained that he could have been standing on something or on his toes. They also told me that they've never received a report of anyone playing a violin in the area, or anyone being in the fenced-off hill either. I essentially looked like an insane person, but the officers were very nice about the whole thing and offered to patrol the area for the next few nights, which helped put my mind at ease. Nothing else happened. Over the next year or two, people finally started moving in, and I tell them all the story about the figure I saw, some of which still used to keep their children in line, which I found funny. One guy nicknamed the council lot Violin Hill, and the name has stuck around our street since then. I even spent a period of time scouring the depths of the internet for the violin tune I kept hearing, but could never find it. There were a few classical pieces that seemed reminiscent, but I've since thought that whatever tune was played must have been self-composed, which creeps me out even more. I'm still in the house. I still tell people the story, and I haven't changed my routine one bit, which has really helped me to block out the fear of the experience. I now game with the blinds closed. The user who posted this story came back with an edit. I've been thinking more and more about the whole ordeal lately after writing this story and decided to go charge up my old phone that was in the bottom of a box in my back room to see if there were any pictures from the past that I had taken. Sure enough, I found this, a picture of Violin Hill from when I first moved in. This was even before the rest of the connecting roads existed and there was just country surrounding me. From my very vague memory, the figure I saw was standing almost above that red and white post in between the trees on the top of the hill. Like I said, they were very far away and the sun was only just coming up. The fence was also quite dilapidated and temporary when I moved in, but as more people started to arrive, the roads were laid down. The council put up a proper perimeter to block off the hill. Is it to protect the land they own? Or something more? I have posted the photo the user submitted of the hill on the podcast Instagram, at NightmareSocietyRadio. So if you're not already following it, I would suggest hopping on there, as moving forward I'll be posting any related photos there. Thank you. I work summers as a camp counselor in the northern parts of Ontario, Canada. On the date this particular incident occurred, I was camping with a group of 10-year-old boys on the same lake the summer camp was based in. So, like a routine camping trip, we canoe out to the site and set up our tents. Me and my co-counselor, Mike, take turns supervising the kids while they swim, build forts, and play games, etc. We cook some food over the fire, sit down and tell stories, cook s'mores, the typical Canadian camping experience. Around 9:30, we tell the kids it's time for bed and they head into their tents, which were positioned a small walk away from the shoreline, but still right in line of sight from where we had the fire pit. So the kids have gone to bed and me and Mike are shooting the breeze by the water, smoking a cigarette, just basically hanging out before we decide to head to our tent and call it a night. What happened next still troubles me to this day and remains my go-to scary campfire story. We were both gazing into the pitch-black night water when we saw a small light approaching us slowly and slightly above water level. We speculated what it could possibly be for a few minutes before it came close enough for us to see that it was mounted on the front of a kayak and that someone was approaching our campsite. Now, it is important to note that as a camp counselor, part of our training goes over how to deal with stranger encounters in an environment where we are responsible for a group of children on public property. I was prepared to give the mystery paddler the typical speech about how we are camping with a group from a recognized organization and we would respectfully ask that they find another campsite. However, this person's appearance shook me to the bones as the light drew near. Paddling this kayak was a woman who looked to be about in her 60s. She had incredibly long wisps of gray hair that was trailing in the water. Her skin looked like old leather, and her dead-looking eyes were tough to spot under all her wrinkles. She looked directly at me, and when she spoke, I realized she was missing most of her teeth.
"Are all your children safe in bed?"
She asked me, pointing in the direction of the tents. Not really knowing how to respond and quite frankly crapping myself, I responded by telling her that they were fine and she had to leave.
That's good. Just as I expected for this time.
She said with a smile, and then turned her kayak and paddled off into the night. At this point in time, myself and Mike were legitimately very creeped out, not only because of the appearance of this mystery woman who resembled a freaking corpse, but also her inquiry on the whereabouts and safety of the kids we had brought on this trip. Not knowing what else to do, we grabbed our hunting knives and sat by the fire after checking on the kids. Half an hour later is where crap started to get really creepy. Across the lake, a female counselor was leading another trip for kids of the same age group. She sent me a text which read something along the lines of, "Hey Sean, stop screwing with us. This isn't funny, my kids are really creeped out." I instantly called her and let her know I had just seen someone near my campsite that seemed eerie and that I was not trying to play a joke. Apparently, one of their kids had opened their tent door to use the restroom. They saw a woman with long hair standing with her arms open towards them, standing near the shoreline. I hope you enjoy tonight's true horror stories. I'm hoping to do a special bonus episode for the month of October, so long as my voice holds up, so stay tuned. And don't forget to follow me on Instagram at NightmareSocietyRadio and Twitter at Society_Radio. Thanks for listening, and until next time, stay safe.